Hello, my name is Victor Barradas, and I am a specially appointed assistant professor working in the Koike Yoshimura lab. I am pleased to present some of my research during the IIR week. The title of my project is Enhancing Motor Skill Learning by Manipulating the Extrinsic Components of the Motor Task. The objective of this project is to find ways to facilitate the acquisition of motor skills. Here, I propose a framework in which I divide the learning task into two components. The first one is extrinsic components and corresponds to the aspects of a task that are external to the central nervous system. For example, redefining the goals of a task or decomposing the task into simpler subtasks. The second component is the intrinsic components and refers to aspects of the task that directly involve the nervous system, such as generating appropriate muscle activations. This component division could help to more systematically identify the factors that influence learning in a motor task. This research could be useful to design rehabilitation protocols for patients with motor impairments, or as we will see, to generate principles for designing tools that are easy to use. Today, I will only focus on identifying and manipulating the extrinsic components of the task to promote faster learning. We start by considering a very simple task, the isometric task. In this task, a subject holds a force sensor and applies forces on it to control a cursor on the screen. Notice that there is no movement in this task, only static force production. The objective of the task is to move the cursor from the center of the screen to different targets. Then we introduce a visual-motor rotation. That means that the mapping between forces and cursor position is changed so that the cursor position is rotated with respect to the direction of the applied force. Therefore, subjects have to learn a new mapping. To identify the components that influence the speed of learning in this isometric task, we use a computational model in which the central nervous system, or CNS, is represented as a controller that takes a target force and provides a motor command to the body to produce a realized force. If the realized force does not match the desired force, then the central nervous system updates itself to minimize this error using a learning algorithm. The simplicity of this task resides in the fact that in isometric tasks, realized forces are a linear function of the motor command. This allows us to visualize the motor system as a very simple two-layer feed-forward neural network. Therefore, we can borrow tools from the neural networks literature to make predictions about the speed of learning in the isometric task. In particular, analyzing the second-order derivatives of the error in the force with respect to the controller parameters W gives us clues about the learning speed. These derivatives form a Hessian matrix, whose eigenvalues define the shape of the learning space. Rounder learning spaces allow faster learning, as you can see in the illustration that fewer iterations are needed to learn in a rounder space. After some math with the Hessian, which I don't have time to show here, we find two learning boosters, that is, extrinsic aspects of the task that can control the speed of learning. The first one is the force manipulability ellipsoid, which is an important concept in robotics. The manipulability ellipsoid describes a mapping between torque at the elbow and the shoulder and force at the hand. Given a certain posture, producing forces is easier in some directions than in others, and this changes with the posture of the arm, as you can see in this little figure. The second learning booster is the distribution of target forces in the task, as you can see here in the blue and red targets. We get that rounder manipulability ellipsoids and target distributions generate rounder Hessian matrices, which also allow faster learning. Therefore, we hypothesize that changing the manipulability ellipsoid or target distribution will also change the speed of learning in the actual task. To test our hypothesis, we performed two experiments. In the first one, we controlled the shape of the manipulability ellipsoid in the virtual environment. We did this by scaling the mapping between hand forces and cursor position in the screen, requiring larger forces on one of the axes to reach the targets. We used three scaling conditions: null in blue, middle in red, and high in green. We then added the visual-motor rotation on top of the squeezing transformation and observed how participants learned the new mapping. Each participant performed the experiment on each of the three conditions on separate days. Our simulations predicted that learning would be faster the rounder the scaling transformation, as was expected from our model, and these results were also observed in the experiments, as you can see here. We can see that the learning rates are similar between the simulations and the experiments, as well as the learning curves, which show how the error in cursor direction is reduced during learning. In experiment 2, we focused on the effect of varying the target distribution during the visomotor rotation task. For this, we created two conditions. In the first condition, targets were distributed uniformly around the center of the screen, as you see in the blue targets. In the second condition, the target position was modified by scaling the vertical position of the target, such that the target distribution resembles an ellipse, as you can see in the red targets. Each participant performed the experiment in each condition on different days. Again, in line with our model, the simulations predicted that learning would be faster for the rounder target distribution. And the experimental results closely matched the learning rates and curves obtained in the simulation, as you can see in the figure. Now that we have confirmed that our model can identify learning boosters in a simple but real task, we can begin applying the computational framework to more complex but ecological tasks in human motor learning. In particular, we're interested in dynamic tasks, where participants need to learn relationships between their motor commands and the actual body motions that they produce. To simplify things, we focus on arm-reaching tasks, in which the arm is placed on a horizontal plane. To model this task, we use a similar approach as before, except that the CNS produces motor commands in response to desired joint accelerations, and the motor commands produce joint torques, generating movements of the joints. And learning takes place when there is a mismatch between the desired and the realized joint accelerations. Our math analysis of the Hessian shows that one of the learning boosters is the inertia matrix, which can be viewed as a mapping from joint torques to joint accelerations, and can also be represented with an ellipse. Therefore, changes to the inertia matrix can speed up or slow down learning. We set out to confirm the effects of manipulating the inertia matrix in a simulation. Here, the task was to learn the dynamics of a 2-degree of freedom arm on the horizontal plane from scratch. We used a distal learning approach to implement learning in the task. Given that the inertia matrix is a function of the posture of the arm, we analyzed how the learning speed changes when learning the local dynamics of the arm around the different postures. We used 6 postures as shown in this figure. Here, we see the ellipse representing the inertia mapping for each posture. However, notice that this is just for visualization purposes, as the ellipse is not in Cartesian coordinates. Furthermore, we see how the ellipses get more stretched out as the arm posture also stretches out. We quantified this by calculating the ratio of the major and minor axis of the ellipses, and you can see this calculations here. In this figure, we see the learning curves for each condition. The learning curve is given as the RMS error between the desired and realized joint acceleration trajectories, and we see how it decreases with each trial. So as predicted by our model, learning is much faster for postures associated with rounder inertia ellipses. In conclusion, we have found a method to identify learning boosters in the extrinsic components of a motor learning task. As we further develop these methods, they could help us create new ways of learning complex tasks in a more efficient manner, and possibly design rehabilitation protocols that allow a speedier recovery for patients with motor impairments. In the near future, we plan on experimentally testing our model's predictions in the dynamic task by using force field paradigms. This will allow us to further test the soundness of our methods. In addition, the inertia matrix of the arm is not only a function of arm posture, but also of the mass and moment of inertia of the limb segments. Because tools directly affect the inertia matrix of the arm, because they change the mass, the moment of inertia, and the arm geometry, our framework could open the possibility of designing tools from a perspective that focuses on the ease to learn. Finally, I would like to thank Professors Yasuharu Koike and Nicholas Schweikhofer for their support, and also my funding sources. Thank you for your attention.